Welcome to the story of Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. On June 22, 1941, over 3 million Axis soldiers crossed into Soviet territory along an 800-mile front, forever changing the course of World War I, II and human history. This was Hitler's gamble to destroy the Soviet Union in a single, devastating campaign. But what began as a lightning strike would become a nightmare that consumed Nazi Germany. To understand Operation Barbarossa, we must first look at the strange alliance that preceded it. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world by signing a non-aggression pact. Behind closed doors, Hitler and Stalin divided Eastern Europe between them. They were ideological enemies playing a dangerous game of mutual benefit. Poland was crushed between them, and for nearly 2 years, Germany and the Soviet Union were partners in conquest. But Hitler never intended this partnership to last. From the beginning, he viewed the Soviet Union as Germany's ultimate enemy. His ideology demanded the destruction of Bolshevism and the conquest of Lebensraum, living space in the East, for the German people. By the summer of 1940, with Western Europe under his control, Hitler turned his gaze eastward. He believed the Soviet Union was weak, its military decapitated by Stalin's purges, and that it could be defeated in a matter of weeks. The planning for Barbarossa was audacious in scale. The German High Command divided their forces into 3 massive army groups. Army Group North would drive toward Leningrad, Army Group Center would thrust toward Moscow, and Army Group South would sweep into Ukraine. The plan called for rapid encirclements using blitzkrieg tactics, armored spearheads. Would pierce Soviet lines while infantry followed to pocket and destroy trapped enemy forces. German intelligence made catastrophic miscalculations. They estimated the Red Army had about 200 divisions, when, in reality, the Soviets could field over 400. They believed Soviet military technology was primitive, and that Stalin's purges had destroyed the Red Army's effectiveness. They assumed the Soviet state would collapse after a few decisive battles, just as France had fallen. These assumptions would prove fatally wrong. Throughout the spring of 1941, Germany assembled the largest invasion force ever gathered. Over 3 million German soldiers, joined by 600,000 troops from Finland, Romania, Hungary, and Italy. They brought 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft. The build-up was massive, yet somehow Stalin refused to believe an invasion was imminent, dismissing dozens of warnings from his own intelligence services and even Winston Churchill. At 3:15 in the morning on June 22, 1941, German artillery opened fire along the entire front. Operation Barbarossa had begun. Thousands of guns shattered the summer silence as 3 million men surged forward. The Luftwaffe launched surprise strikes against Soviet airfields, destroying over 1,200 Soviet aircraft in the first day alone, most while they were still on the ground. The Soviet military was caught completely unprepared. Soviet forces along the border were devastated. Communications broke down immediately. Officers couldn't contact their superiors, units couldn't coordinate, and conflicting orders added to the chaos. Many Soviet commanders didn't even believe they were under attack, thinking it must be a training exercise gone wrong. Some border units fought to the last man, but many simply disintegrated under the German onslaught. The German advance was breathtaking in its speed. Army Group Center's panzer divisions raced forward, covering up to 50 miles per day. Within a week, they had penetrated over 200 miles into Soviet territory. The Blitzkrieg tactics that had conquered Western Europe seemed to be working perfectly. German commanders radioed back optimistic reports. Many believed the campaign would be over by autumn. The first great encirclement battles erupted. At Minsk, German pincers closed around massive Soviet formations. Then at Smolensk, another enormous pocket formed. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers found themselves trapped, surrounded by German armour and infantry. These cauldron battles, or Kesselschlacht, were exactly what the German plan called for destroying the Red Army in decisive battles near the border. By late July, the Germans had captured over 600,000 Soviet prisoners. The numbers were staggering. Entire Soviet armies had ceased to exist. German newsreels showed endless columns of defeated Soviet soldiers. Hitler and his generals were convinced they had won. They began discussing what to do after the Soviet Union collapsed. But they failed to notice that despite these catastrophic losses, the Red Army kept fighting, and new Soviet divisions kept appearing at the front. On July 3rd, Stalin finally addressed the Soviet nation. His voice cracking with emotion, he called for scorched earth tactics, destroy everything that might be useful to the enemy. He demanded fanatical resistance, invoking Russian patriotism rather than communist ideology. This was now the Great Patriotic War. The Soviet people, facing extinction at the hands of Nazi Germany, began to mobilize on an unprecedented scale. An incredible evacuation effort began. Over 1,500 Soviet factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and moved east beyond the Ural Mountains, out of German reach. Entire industries were relocated workers, their families, machinery, everything. Within months, these evacuated factories would be producing tanks, aircraft, and weapons at rates the Germans never imagined possible. The Soviet Union was transforming into a war machine. German troops began encountering Soviet weapons that shocked them. The T-34 tank, with its sloped armour and powerful 76 mm gun, was superior to most German tanks. The KV-1 heavy tank was nearly impervious to German anti-tank weapons. Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers, nicknamed Stalin's organs, delivered devastating barrages. German intelligence had been completely wrong about Soviet military technology. Soviet resistance grew more desperate and effective. Soldiers who might have surrendered in June now fought to the death. Towns and cities became fortresses. Every village required a battle to capture. The German advance, while still making progress, was slowing down. German casualties, light at first, began to mount. The easy victories were over, replaced by grinding, brutal combat. August brought the first serious rains, and the roads turned to mud. The Rasputitsa, the season of mud, came early. German vehicles designed for European highways became stuck. Supply trucks couldn't reach the front. Panzer divisions ground to a halt. The vast distances of Russia, the primitive road network, and the weather were revealing themselves as enemies as dangerous as the Red Army. A fierce debate erupted in the German High Command. The original plan called for Army Group Center to push directly to Moscow, but Hitler made a fateful decision. In August, he ordered Army Group Center's panzers to swing south to help encircle Soviet forces in Ukraine. His generals were furious. They believed Moscow was the key capture, the capital and the Soviet Union would collapse. But Hitler wanted the economic resources of Ukraine and the destruction of Soviet armies there. Hitler's decision led to the greatest encirclement battle in history. At Kiev, German pincers trapped over 600,000 Soviet soldiers. The pocket closed in September, and for weeks, savage fighting consumed entire Soviet armies. When it ended, the Germans had captured 665,000 prisoners. It was the largest single military defeat in history. Hitler seemed vindicated in his decision. But the Kiev encirclement consumed precious time. September passed, then early October. The window for capturing Moscow before winter was closing rapidly. German troops who had started the campaign, expecting to be home by Christmas, now faced the terrifying prospect of winter warfare in Russia. The panzers had travelled over 1,000 miles, their mechanical reliability deteriorating daily. Spare parts were running out. Germany's logistical situation was becoming critical. The Wehrmacht relied heavily on horses. Over 750,000 horses were used in Barbarossa, and they required enormous amounts of fodder. Supplies had to travel hundreds of miles over damaged roads and different-gauge railway tracks that required conversion. German trains couldn't use Soviet rails without extensive modifications. Every mile they advanced made the supply situation worse. On October 2, 1941, Operation Typhoon began the assault on Moscow. Over 1 million German soldiers drove toward the Soviet capital. Initially, success seemed within reach. 2 more massive encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk trapped 600,000 more Soviet soldiers. Panic gripped Moscow. Government offices began evacuating, foreign embassies fled. Would Stalin stay or abandon the capital? On October 19th, Stalin declared Moscow under siege and announced he would remain in the capital. This decision was crucial for Soviet morale. If Stalin fled, the Soviet Union might have collapsed. Instead, his presence inspired desperate resistance. Soviet troops dug defensive positions in rings around the city. Factory workers formed militia units. Women and children dug anti-tank ditches. Moscow would not fall without a fight. Stalin recalled his best general, Gorky Zhukov, from the defense of Leningrad and put him in command of Moscow's defense. Zhukov was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly determined. He coordinated the arrival of fresh divisions from Siberia, troops trained for winter warfare, equipped with winter clothing, and accustomed to extreme cold. These reinforcements would prove decisive. October became a nightmare for the Germans. The autumn rains came with a vengeance, turning everything to liquid mud. The Rasputitsa reached its peak. Tanks sank to their turrets. Trucks were abandoned by the thousands. Soldiers struggled through knee-deep muck. The advance toward Moscow slowed to a crawl. Supply trucks couldn't reach the front lines. Ammunition ran short, food became scarce, and still Moscow remained beyond reach. In mid-November, the weather suddenly changed. The mud froze solid as temperatures plummeted. German commanders were relieved, at least now. They could move again. On November 15th, the final push for Moscow began. German troops advanced through snow and cold, getting closer to the capital. By early December, advance units were within sight of the Kremlin spires. They could see Moscow through their binoculars, but they could advance no further. The German army was not prepared for Russian winter. Hitler and his planners had expected victory before winter arrived, so they never supplied winter clothing. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags and newspapers. Frostbite ravaged entire units. Weapons froze and wouldn't fire. Tank engines wouldn't start. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. More German soldiers were lost to cold than to combat. The Wehrmacht was freezing to death within sight of Moscow. On December 5, 1941, Zhukov struck. Fresh Siberian divisions, properly equipped for winter, smashed into the exhausted German lines. The Germans were shocked. They believed the Soviets had no reserves left. But over 100 divisions, including troops pulled from the Far East after Soviet spies confirmed Japan wouldn't attack, now fell upon Army Group Center. The tide of war was turning. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht was in full retreat. Entire divisions collapsed. Panicked German soldiers fled westward, abandoning tanks, artillery, and equipment. Hitler, watching his forces recoil from Moscow, made another fateful decision. He issued the Stand Fast order, no retreat under any circumstances. Generals who advocated withdrawal were fired. The army would hold its ground or die trying. German casualties were catastrophic. By the end of December, Army Group Centre had lost over 500,000 men. The Panzer divisions, which began the campaign with over 3,600 tanks, had fewer than 1,000 operational tanks remaining. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. Officers who had been confident of victory 6 months earlier now faced the prospect of total defeat. Behind German lines, Soviet partisans emerged from the forests. These irregular fighters, made up of soldiers cut off by the German advance, escaped prisoners and local volunteers, waged guerrilla warfare. They destroyed supply depots, ambushed convoys, and blew up railway lines. The German rear area became nearly as dangerous as the front lines. Vast numbers of German troops had to be diverted to security duties instead of frontline combat. By January 1942, the Soviet counter-offensive had pushed the Germans back 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow. The immediate threat to the capital was over. The Red Army continued attacking through the brutal winter, trying to encircle and destroy Army Group Centre completely. They didn't quite succeed in that ultimate goal, but they had achieved something more important. They had proven that Nazi Germany could be beaten. While the battle for Moscow raged, another tragedy unfolded in the north. Army Group North had encircled Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second-largest city. Hitler ordered that the city should not be captured but starved into submission. Beginning in September 1941, Leningrad was cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. Over 3 million people were trapped inside, civilians, soldiers, women, children, facing the longest siege in modern history. The siege of Leningrad became an unspeakable horror. Food supplies were exhausted within months. Rations were reduced to 125 grams of bread per day, barely enough to survive. People starved by the hundreds of thousands. During the winter of 1941-42, temperatures plunged, but there was no fuel for heating. Civilians burned furniture, books, anything that could burn. The death toll was staggering. Estimates range from 800,000 to 1.5 million people perished during the 872-day siege. The only supply line into Leningrad was across Lake Ladoga. In summer, boats braved German artillery and air attacks. In winter, trucks drove across the frozen lake, the road of life. This ice road was constantly under bombardment, and the ice was treacherous. Trucks broke through and sank. But this thin lifeline kept the city barely alive. Without it, Leningrad would have died completely. Leningrad never surrendered. Despite starvation, cold, constant shelling, and death all around them, the citizens and soldiers held out. Factories continued producing weapons even as workers collapsed at their machines. The siege would continue until January 1944, making it the longest and most destructive siege in history. The suffering of Leningrad became a symbol of Soviet determination. They would endure any hardship rather than submit to Nazi Germany. By early 1942, it was clear that Operation Barbarossa had failed. Every assumption underlying the plan had proven false. The campaign was supposed to last 8-10 weeks. It had been 6 months, and there was no end in sight. The Red Army was supposed to have 200 divisions. They had fielded over 600. The Soviet state was supposed to collapse. Instead, it was producing more weapons than ever. Germany was now trapped in exactly the kind of long war it couldn't win. The psychological impact on German troops was profound. Soldiers who had marched into Russia, believing in inevitable victory, now faced an endless war against an enemy who seemed to have infinite manpower. They had seen things that would haunt them forever. The brutality of the Eastern Front exceeded anything in the West. The ideological nature of the war meant it was fought with savage cruelty on both sides. The Eastern Front was hell on earth. The Soviet Union's industrial mobilization was succeeding beyond anyone's imagination. The evacuated factories were now operating at full capacity. Soviet production of tanks and aircraft was exceeding German production. The T-34 tank was being built by the thousands. New weapons like the IL-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft were devastating German positions. The technological and industrial advantage Hitler had counted on was disappearing. Germany's strategic situation was deteriorating on every front. The Soviet Union refused to collapse. Britain remained undefeated and, backed by American aid, was growing stronger. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the war. Hitler, incredibly, declared war on America, adding the world's greatest industrial power to his list of enemies. Germany now faced the combined might of the Soviet Union, British Empire, and the United States. The winter of 1941–42 marked the turning point of World War II. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, had failed. Nazi Germany would never again have the initiative in the East. The Red Army would continue to grow stronger, while the Wehrmacht could only grow weaker. The road ahead would bring 3 more years of brutal warfare, culminating in Soviet tanks rolling into Berlin. But here, in the frozen wastes before Moscow, Hitler's dream of empire died. Operation Barbarossa changed the course of human history. It was the beginning of Nazi Germany's end, though that end would take 3.5 more years and cost millions more lives. The Eastern Front would become the war's decisive theatre. Roughly 80% of German military casualties occurred fighting the Soviet Union. The brutality unleashed during Barbarossa would result in over 25 million Soviet dead. Military and civilian combined a scale of suffering almost impossible to comprehend. The failure of Barbarossa demonstrated the limits of military power. Germany's army was the most professional and tactically skilled in the world, but it couldn't overcome strategic miscalculation, ideological blindness, and the determination of a people fighting for survival. Hitler's racist ideology had led him to catastrophically underestimate the Soviet Union's capabilities and the Russian people's will to resist. The lessons of Operation Barbarossa remain relevant today. It showed that wars cannot be won by initial tactical success alone. Logistics, industrial capacity, and national morale matter more than brilliant battlefield victories. It demonstrated that no military, however powerful, can conquer a vast country whose people are determined to resist. And it proved that ideological certainty can blind leaders to reality until it's too late. The scars of Operation Barbarossa still mark Eastern Europe and Russia. Entire cities were destroyed. Tens of millions died. The suffering was so immense that it defies description. But from that suffering came victory over Nazi tyranny. The Soviet soldiers who stopped the Wehrmacht before Moscow, who held out in starving Leningrad, who fought in thousands of desperate battles. They saved not only their own country, but all of Europe from Nazi conquest.